Hello, and welcome to this industry roundtable discussion on next steps in sustainability, achieving reliability in renewable energy. My name is Fazia Marzuki, and I'm with the Bloomberg NEF team. Today, we've got 6 panelists who will be talking about renewable energy and how we can ensure reliability for the future energy transition. The first question I'd like to put forth to our panelists is, let's talk about it from an argument perspective. People say that natural gas was the transition fuel for coal. And natural gas is supposed to bridge us into a renewable energy world and the energy transition. But there's still coal today. So maybe the first question I'd like to pose it to our panelists, Danielle, what would you say to industry participants who are saying that what's the role of gas in the future? Are we potentially moving on too quickly into renewable energy that we're almost bypassing gas's role as a transition fuel? What would you say in response to that?
Thank you. And I'm Danielle Merfeld with GE Renewable Energy. Within GE, we have 3 sort of legs of the stool as we think about the energy transition. We have our renewables business, which includes grid. We have our business around gas power. So, those are the 3 pieces: renewable, grid, and gas power. And today, we see that grid and gas both play really critical supporting roles in achieving reliability across our renewable energy infrastructure space. Parts of the world are increasing their renewable penetration faster than others. So we're going to see where gas plays a critical role, where grid needs to be maintained or even improved or changed in its operation, but it won't be universal everywhere. So I think there's still a really important role that all of these technologies play, and they will change over time, but it will be highly regional.
Keith, you're taking care of a portfolio for renewable energy in the Asia Pacific. Would you have anything to add to that?
Absolutely. And then speaking more globally, I think that Daniela's points there are very valid. We're moving from a world that currently is just 2/3 fossil fuels to one that's going to be 2/3 renewables by 2050. So natural gas absolutely has a part to play in that. It will still be a part. But the big question is how we evolve the power generation system. The power generation system has always been a diverse portfolio of sources of power generation, and that's evolving and getting more complex. And Danielle touched on a few things there, that the grid, how the grid interfaces. We now have a more distributed set of power generation, more local, right down to the household. And eventually, hopefully, we'll talk about electric vehicles, which ultimately are batteries that are floating around the place. So there's a broad spectrum there of new technologies that are going to come into the power generation system. But natural gas has a part to play. Coal, I genuinely believe, does not have a part to play. The sooner we move away from it, goodbye, good riddance. But gas has a part to play, and it will still be there. But equally, wearing my renewable hat, the faster we can push gas out of it, I would equally think that's important. But I think for the next my generation or the rest of my career, gas will still be part of it.
That's great. So some people in the industry would say natural gas is a potential hurdle or an obstacle to implementing renewable energy and sort of like moving forward with this energy transition. The next question I'd sort of more broadly, I'd like to put it to Sujay. What's your take on today? What are the main hurdles with achieving this transition, moving forward with the transition to more renewable energy power generation?
Thanks, Fazia. This is Sujay Shah from Standard Chartered Bank. I lead the clean tech sector coverage here. So it was an interesting question in terms of what the key barriers are. I would list a few. The first and the foremost, and I'm sure we're going to speak a lot around this, is around the reliability of renewable power and whether that can be provided 24/7. The second one is cost. Now that is coming down quite rapidly almost everywhere, but we need to remember there are still markets like Indonesia, most of, in fact, Southeast Asia, where fossil fuels are more cost competitive compared to renewable power. And there's a question of energy access before the cleanness of energy. So we do need to remember that the different regions with different sort of requirements. And the third one, and as a banker, one I which must highlight quite forcefully, is around the financing challenge itself. Now, the number for energy transition varies anywhere between a few $1 trillion to up to about 50 trillion over the next 4 to 5 decades. And where is this money going to come from? The role that institutional investors actually need to play, because from a bank perspective, there's only a limited amount that banks can finance. So where is actually this money going to come from? And the third more important bit is that bulk of this money is going to be required in emerging markets. And who's actually going to provide this financing in markets which need it the most are the key questions which might sort of determine which way the energy transition goes and how the speed at which it goes.
That's great. I want to send it maybe to Abigail. So you, as a sort of a prominent industry player in the solar industry, how would you convince Sujay that solar is the way to go? Solar is what we want to do and how we're going to make it through this energy transition. What would be your pitch in order to the financial community about how you would overcome some of these hurdles that we just heard?
Yeah, thank you. And good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. I'm Abby Hopper. I'm the CEO of the Solar Energy Industries Association, which is a trade association here in the United States that represents the solar and the solar plus storage industry. And so I would start there, Sujay, and you know this, that the transition and the technological advances and the cost reductions, particularly in storage, and the pairing of these resources together really addresses a lot of the reliability concerns. I think that Dr. Q can talk about his technology and his company, and I'll let him do that. But I do think that that is by far the most impactful piece and the most exciting part of this transition. I do think that, to the earlier question about sort of the role of natural gas and the length of this transition, I think we would all agree that there will be natural gas. I think the real question is how much more are we going to invest in it, right? Like there's what's the assets that exist now, but new assets and whether or not they become sunk costs or stranded costs for ratepayers is a really important issue. And we spent a lot of time sort of looking at solar plus storage versus natural gas, what their generation portfolio looks like, what their cost projections are, and why that's really a better outcome. I would just add sort of, I can't stop your financing. That's your job, Sujay. But I do think that if we think about sort of access, one of the things I love about this technology is its scalability. And so, we can build huge power plants in the middle of deserts, and we can light up an operating room in a small country that maybe is experiencing energy poverty, and we can do everything in between. I think it's fairly unique in that way. And so to sort of those emerging markets, I think they have applications where a centralized grid system just might not be applicable, but a distributed system that provides solutions for people is much more transformative.
So we talked about growth in gas, and we are in a Qatar Economic Forum, and so the idea is that a lot of global gas producers and suppliers are touting the idea that natural gas is supposed to help with reliability and renewable energy. But I would like to turn it now to maybe first to Dr. Shanku. What aspects, or what kind of framework, what kind of roadmap do you see? Or what are the things we need to do in order to ensure or work towards ensuring there is reliability for renewable energy production that perhaps doesn't involve natural gas, or will it have to involve natural gas? Your thoughts?
Hi, folks. This is Shang Chu from Canadian Solar. Now, first, let me address to what Daniel and Keith said. Let's face it, it's impossible to decarbonize fossil fuel because fossil fuel is carbon. And if you have a gas facility, let's say a combined cycle gas facility already there, you may want to run it to the end of your life. But if you're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in 5 years to build a new gas power facility, well, frankly speaking, that will be your sunk cost, because today, solar plus lithium battery storage is already reliable and also cost competitive. Now, I want to tell you one story. We have one project in California. It's a solar plus storage project. We call it SLATE. It's a 300 megawatt solar plus 550 megawatt hours of storage. Now, it was one of the largest in California back in 2017, 2018. So it was a challenge by that time. So we actually had a offsite all-hand strategy meeting in Carmel, California, back in 2018. We look at all different kind of lithium battery technologies. We also looked into flow batteries. Then we design our own battery pack, the BMS, the PCS. And then by the time when we locked down the design at the end of 2020, now the cost of solar is already below 2 cents per kilowatt hours. And the cost of 4-hour battery storage is around 4 cents. So altogether, around 6 cents. That's solar plus 4 hours of energy storage. Now, if you want to build a new gas facility in California, I guess your LCOE will also be the range of 5 to 7 cents. So that's my point. Rather than building a new gas facility, you would rather use that money and also time to build a solar plus energy storage facility. Now, come to the technology. What are the breakthrough technology we require to make to optimize the solar plus storage asset? And actually both solar and wind technology are already very mature. You can already deploy it in large scale. So if I'm going to point to one breakthrough technology, I would say that will be the artificial intelligence and big data enabled energy planning and trading system. Because in order to optimize your storage facility, you have to make minute by minute trading decision. And only that kind of system can work.
That's fascinating, and I'd love to talk about the game-changing technologies in just a moment. But we've heard a lot about solar. I'd actually like to turn it to Ina now to talk about the sort of balance between solar and the other clean energy technologies. Maybe Ina, if you'd like to share sort of on what are your thoughts on what are the frameworks and sort of potential building blocks in order to ensure reliability for renewable energy.
Yes, so I'll address some of the subjects. First of all, I think regarding the gas, I think gas position right now in the world is pretty safe. 80% of the global energy is being still produced by different fossil fuels, if it's oil or coal or gas. So I don't think there's any risk for it to disappear anytime in the near future. According to the United Nations, also 60% of the global greenhouse gas emissions are directly caused by the way that we're harnessing our energy. So that's kind of the negative side, of course, of fossil fuels. So, of course, all of us are kind of, I think the whole world right now is in the same side, and we would all like to see a 100% environmentally friendly world. So what's actually stopping it? I think the lack of variety. Because solar energy, wind energy, they kind of started their commercialization early on. And many countries kind of got locked on those technologies, which is amazing. They're great technologies. Like I'm speaking from Israel, we have a great resource of sun. But at the moment that the government put some solar farms here and saw that it's working, they said, okay, so we have the sun, we don't need wind, we don't need wave. We don't need any type of other energy. And that's kind of a problem, because then they started building these huge farms, and the night comes and then hundreds of megawatts shut off and it's not so good for the grid. And then, of course, you can't get the stability. So the best way, again, although I'm from EcoWave Power, a wave energy company, so I'm not exactly objective, I'm a strong believer in wave energy, I do think that the solution for kind of having a 100% renewable energy friendly world is combining all renewable energy sources together. So during the day when it's very sunny and not so wavy or not so windy, then the solar energy will be the main source. During the night, it can be wind or wave. And also depending on the country, depending on the natural resources. So I think that kind of, policymakers need to get out of kind of the technology that we already know that are working, that are cost efficient. It took them 20 to 30 years to get to that point, and start also opening up to new technologies, which are especially complementary to the type of technologies that are already working in their countries. And then really we have a much better chance of having the 100% renewable energy friendly world.
That's great. I love the idea of sort of like diversity and inclusive, making sure that there's a mix in order to sort of hedge all your bets as well. I'd like to turn maybe on that note, I'd like to turn the next question to Keith. In your sort of from an investment perspective, are you going for a mix in order to ensure reliability, or is there a particular technology or particular aspect that you're focusing on with regards to your investments and how you see the industry?
Yeah. So as a infrastructure investor, you're looking for long-term sustainable offtake. So there, to Dr. Chu's comments there in terms of in the solar, when you look at the solar and you look at the cost competitiveness in certain markets, because I think Sujay touched on a very interesting point there. California is not comparable with Indonesia, or with other locations for a variety of reasons. The access and then the structure. You also have, say, for example, Japan, which is much more expensive than say other parts of the world to produce electricity. So as an infrastructure investor, you're looking at somewhat established technologies. I equally take Dr. Chu's comment there that solar and wind are now well established, and you're looking for long-term, 30-year plus assets that are well managed, and that you have your offtake from that, whether that is merchant, what we call just the power price, or whether that's government backed or locked in by some way. But that's what you're looking at. Looking at something like wave power or other technologies, that's a different investor base that would at this stage would still be more venture capital, I would suggest.
Danielle, would you have anything else to add to this line of discussion?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And just to add to the idea about variability and flexibility, sort of these different resources, another way to think about it, in addition to variety of renewable technologies that complement each other, which is certainly a key tenet of the renewable future, there's also variability geographically. And in addition to sort of one of the things that might hold us back is permitting and regulation of more renewable assets. There's also the permitting and the scale of growth of our transmission and distribution infrastructure. Because if we can link more of our renewable assets broadly across regions through a grid interplay, then we've got more resilience, we've got more capability to manage variability and balance. Things like storage and solar are really great for helping close some of that gap. But there's still going to be frequency response mechanisms. We're going to need sort of this integrated capability, and then, of course, grid technologies to solve some of those stability issues that might happen just because of our power electronics that we're plugging into the grid in a new way. The grid is designed to operate based on synchronous generators. And as we replace those with more variable renewable energy, we just have to operate the grid differently. So there's this transition where we want the economics to win, we want the stability and resilience, and we want favorable outcomes for everyone. And I think we have to think holistically, even to the market models. How are we rewarding capacity and flexibility? So this is one of the most exciting systems problems that the world is facing, and it's a challenge, I think, for everyone in all sectors and functions across business and government.
Definitely one of those challenges. Ina, would you like to add to that, perhaps?
Yes, I just would like to refer to what Keith said. I think that kind of what he said exactly kind of resonances with what I said before, is that really the main problem of the world is that kind of ancient, no offense, way of thinking, that kind of what works for a very, very long period of time is the only thing that we should use, and that's what is not enabling the variety. But there are many large-scale companies which in the past had the same vision, like big electrical companies, which are now investors in eco-wave power. For example, EDF, the French national electrical company, is now investing with us in a power station in Israel. Meridian, the largest electric company in Australia and New Zealand, it signed with us a collaboration agreement. So I really think the world and different funds, different governmental organizations need to move from this kind of blocked way of thinking, because this is in the end what will enable us to have the diversity that we aspire, again, for to have the transition to a 100% renewable energy friendly world. So Keith, I would rethink the answer.
Okay.
Keith, do you want to respond to that? Or?
Oh well, no. I don't disagree with what you're saying. I think what I said, was that it would be me as an investor. I think the question was asked to me in terms of as an infrastructure investor, as a venture capital investor. So absolutely. So a large organization, you mentioned a few companies there, would have a section, and I'm sure Danielle in GE, there would be a portion of the capital pool that you would put into emerging technologies, emerging opportunities, and whether that's on the grid, whether that's investing in AI. I think that's a fascinating point that Dr. Chu has brought up, as well as Daniela there, in terms of the grid integration we have here in Europe. We have, in Ireland, is as an island where I'm based, we're pushing 40% renewables and heading towards 60%. So the grid and how we interface that with the United Kingdom and Europe is going to play a huge part of it. But no, I take your point, and excuse me, in terms of your reaction to it. But I do believe that there are those technologies. Solar was once that. If you go back to 2006, or when Dr. Chu started Canadian Solar in 2001, solar was 20 times the cost of what it is now, where there's been a 95% cost reduction. So it may well come in other technologies. So I'll hand the mic back.
So, Sujay, we talked about sort of old mindset and needing to transition and sort of the resources that might potentially be required in order to enable this. Would you like to add anything to what we've been discussing?
Yeah, it was a fascinating discussion, and I think the exchange between Ina and Keith is also something that sort of plays internally within Standard Chartered as well, right? So there is always newer technologies coming up, and if you think about energy transition in a broader scale, right? So one is obviously we're talking about things like solar and wind, which Dr. Chu said is more established now, but there are equally new technologies like green hydrogen, batteries, CCUS, that are increasingly coming up. And the only thing I can add is that the pace at which these transitions are now happening is quite unprecedented compared to what used to happen earlier. So earlier, it used to take a couple of decades for these technologies to become mainstream, whereas now that transition is becoming faster and faster. And it's incumbent, I guess, on all of us to make sure that within our organizations, we are responding adequately. So for instance, at Standard Chartered, we have set up sort of distinct working groups to tackle each of these subsectors as they come up. And we are now looking at financing. For instance, we financed some of the battery plants that have come up on the EV side. We've also advised one of our clients on green hydrogen in terms of what projects they could invest in. So that pace of transition and the rate at which our internal organizations respond to change is extremely important for the overall energy transition progress.
Yeah, talking about you talked about sort of a team that you've set up for doing all of this. I'd like to pose the next question to Abigail. So we talked about the enablers for the transition. Of course, the technology needs to be developed. Needs to advance in order to move us along this transition. But in order to execute it in the time frame that we want to carry out this energy transition, what else do we need to make it work, Abigail?
Yeah, no, it's an important question, and I think sort of goes to the point that Sujay raised early on, like what will the pace of this transition be, right? And it's impacted by lots of things. We haven't talked a lot about policy yet. That's where I spend most of my time, is on the policy front. And obviously there's a variety of, national policy, local policy that impacts this. I could go on about that, but I won't. I think one of the things that sometimes gets forgotten is the human element of this transition, both in terms of the customers that we serve and whom we choose to employ. And I think if this is going to be a successful transition that really has the support of the communities that are impacted by these energy transitions, we have to be really intentional. So I think about sort of citing solar projects or citing wind projects, citing wave projects, doesn't matter, right? But citing and building community support and really earning that social license to operate is a really important piece of it. And so I think we have an opportunity in this transition to do it better than perhaps it's been done in the past, right? Instead of like plopping down facilities and communities that perhaps were not always had a voice, we can really engage in a very different way. So I think that's that will be one of the markers of success, is if we can do that in a meaningful way. I think also, we just talked in the United States about meeting our current president's climate goals, and we will quadruple the size of the solar workforce, right? And then think about that times the entire world. But in my many people's goal, and mine in particular, is to make sure that workforce reflects the diversity of our country, right? The United States is an incredibly diverse country, and our workforce is not at that point yet. And again, it requires intentionality. It requires a commitment to doing that. It requires outreach to communities and people that perhaps we haven't always sought to recruit from. But it also requires sort of a different thought process, right? We're not looking to just provide a job, right? We're looking to provide careers, and we're looking to provide entrepreneurial opportunities. And so as you guys are talking about sort of these new and emerging technologies, that's an incredible opportunity to create wealth and create business ownership, perhaps in communities that haven't always had that opportunity. So that's one of the parts that, I find so many things exciting about this transition. When Daniel was talking about the grid interface, I was like, yes. But this piece as well, right? Like the human element, energy is one of those things that impacts every single human on this planet. And so making sure that we are inclusive and deliberate in how we employ folks and how we distribute this energy, I think, is an important part of this transition.
So in order to make renewable energy reliable, we need reliable people. Right. Does anybody else maybe want to chime in on the resource? What are the necessary resources and enablers? Maybe if we want to elaborate a bit more on the human capital element, people.
I think the human part is so important, and I think Abigail, thank you so much for bringing it up. As you said, the communities that we're going to build all these power stations in, the impact on them, and whether that's the wave technology, whether that's offshore wind with the fishermen, whether that's in a community on the side of a hill. So somebody visually was looking up at a hill for many years, and now there's wind turbines. To one person's eyes, they're things of beauty, and another person's eyes, they're literally eyesores. So bringing the world with us, and the communities that we exist in will be extremely important. We talk and we throw around numbers of 4 times the increase in the United States of solar, or X increase in EV cars, which is probably less impactful, but in other power generation sources. But that they do need to get the permitting. They do need to get through the local communities, and we all have so much experience of objections, of court cases, of delays, etc. So that's something that we can't lose sight of, and we need people constantly working on.
Please, Dr. Shaw.
I also want to echo on the comment on the human factor, and which is indeed very important. Now, Canadian Solar has built and operated factories in 7 different countries and regions, and now, in my 25-year solar experience, I always feel like it is important not only to bring solar and renewable to the community, but also make sure that the community get economic value and also develop their own human capital with renewable. Now, Avi, you mentioned United States. I also want to mention Africa, because don't forget that somewhere around 1.2 billion people in the world still has no electricity, and I believe 600 or 700 million of them living in sub-Saharan Africa. And now solar is a perfect choice, perfect tool to provide not only the access to the electricity, but also I call it the energy equality to those peoples. And now, back in 2014, I went to Paris for the COP21. And then I made a call. I said, well, why don't we light up the Africa using solar? And now one of the topic is infrastructure, right? And solar is actually require very little infrastructure, and also, for the countries with a weak grid. And solar, it will be the best way. Also, solar can create lots of local jobs.
And I'll just add, I agree with everything my fellow panelists have said here about the human perspective, whether it's in the factories, how we make things, what kind of new jobs emerge, and even the fact that we have consumers and producers that are more company or even individual household level. The one thing I would add is there's also an opportunity for households or individuals to play a role on the load side, because that stability and maintenance of resilience at the grid level, we always think of it as a generation side issue, and transmission and distribution manages the generation and manages at the high level how we interfere with the way the normal operation is to keep things stable. There's an untapped opportunity to engage consumers at all levels in their load management without even them noticing, but it's got to be done in collaboration. And I think that's one way to enable renewable energy to be not just highly penetrated, but reliably highly penetrated, is to start pulling on both of those sides of both of those levers for value.
I'm going to let Ina and Sujay chime in here. Maybe Ina, you first.
Thank you. So basically, from personal experience, I would like to say that I think that the thing that is stopping, let's say, Wave Power, my company, the most, is really lack of regulations and lack of policies, similar to what Abigail said. Because let's say the Gibraltar, we have a working power station grid connected in Gibraltar since 2016. The construction of the power station was 6 months, but trying to get the regulation in order to be able to construct was like 2 years. And that's with a government that was amazing and was extremely committed and supportive. So think like that you have to penetrate each and every market that completely has no regulation for new energy sources. And it happened to us day by day. We install our floaters on breakwaters, on piers, on jetties. These kind of structures, they mostly are owned by coastal cities or ports. And we have like 100 emails a day of ports and coastal cities contacting us and saying, we want this in our city. And then we say, okay, great, we're coming, we're going to put it there. What do we have to do? And then the answer is, we don't know. There's no policy. Let us set the policy and come back to us. So the technology readiness is there. And really the excitement from the client and the desire from cities to have energy diversity is there. But like the connecting point, which is the regulation, is not there yet for innovative technology. And I think that's a big problem when the technology kind of bypasses the regulation. The regulation goes after the technology. And that really stops progress.
So I think what we're going to do in the last 10 minutes or so of the session, let's do a bit of a round robin, because we sort of my panelist has reminded me I haven't talked about policy just yet. So let's spend the last 10 minutes to talk about for each of you to hopefully share with us maybe your one key policy aspect or key enabler that governments and institutions need to establish in order to ensure that we have an ecosystem that allows renewable energy to thrive. One, it actually enables the sort of large-scale production of it, and also addressing reliability at the same stage. So I did want Sujay to start. So we're gonna go gentlemen first. We'll start with Sujay, and then we'll go to Dr. Sean, Keith, and then we'll go on to the ladies on the panel to close up. Okay, so everybody round robin of the one key policy-related aspect that you think will ensure this transition.
Sure. So I think, what sort of emerged quite conclusively from this conversation is that everyone agrees that the opportunity is quite large. And this is going to require lots and lots of investors to put in money. And the number one thing that any investor will look for is stability and predictability of policy. So I think quite a few times we've had change in governments and change in regulations which come post that, lots of investor uncertainty. So I think the best thing that the governments can do is provide very clear, long-term, predictable guidance to the market in terms of where they see the growth coming, and then provide options or other mechanisms for them to get those projects in place. And number two, I would say, would be around the permitting and the licenses, which again is quite key for especially emerging markets.
Okay, now over to Dr. Sean.
Well, actually, my comment is almost the same as Suji. Policy is important, especially for solar and also for storage. For example, in United States, we still need policy change in quite a few states in order to allow battery storage to be installed on the connected to the utility. And also, in the United States, we always talk about ITC, and ITC is also important. And also, I think some kind of further like tax regulations. If somehow we can allow solar and storage asset to qualify, for REITs, that would be very, very good. Canadian Solar has one fund, we call it Canadian Solar Infrastructure Fund, traded on Tokyo Stock Exchange, because at this moment, Japan is the only place where solar asset can qualify for REITs. And I hope we will see that in the United States.
Now over to Keith.
Oh, it's such a broad topic, and we spoke there of something very specific, and Dr. Chu of the United States, but it's a global issue. And I think from a top down and bottom up. So from the top down, I think the best thing that governments can do is to pass the net zero targets by 2050. There's a global momentum to that. I think there's 65 countries that have made that binding. That needs to continue, because that sets the overarching framework. And then from the bottom up, taking Ina's points there in terms of new technologies, but across the globe, there are different issues and challenges, whether it's how permits or the legal system in a particular country works, how you can get access to that harbour, how you can get access to that field to put your wind farm in. And there needs to be in each country then the coordination to make that happen. But I think if it comes from the top down that we are going on this direction, then that will force governments and people's hands that they will need to make a number of these changes to permitting laws, to large grid interconnections, to in Africa, as we spoke about there earlier on, which is much more distributed, much more local, how all of these things happen. But I think the leadership from the large economies of the world, the large governments of the world, that forcing net zero, and then the others will trickle down from that is what's important.
All right, now I'm going to go to Danielle, and then Ina, and then Abigail. So
great, thank you. And I will say much of what I was thinking is very similar to what we've heard. So I'll just augment by saying, rather than say a specific policy, I'll talk about outcomes. Being able to have assurance of opportunity and what the market will look like is key. Certainly having permitting, licensing, there's too many barriers, even in a more mature renewable energy space such as wind, which I would argue still has a tremendous runway of change ahead of it. Being able to deploy some of those new technologies and prove out how they can contribute to the health of the grid is really only at the pace it was last year. Having the increasing pace will be difficult to meet without more build out, faster permitting, and of course, transmission and distribution infrastructure that supports it globally.
Ina?
Yes. So I will formulate. First of all, I agree with everybody. Everything that was said is very important. But I will formalize my answer in a way of wishing. So I have two wishes from the policymakers. One, just make policies. Stop. Because in our case, they just don't exist in many of the countries. And really, number two is similar to what Sujay have said, is if you're making policies, make them stable. Because in many European countries like the UK and Portugal, they have set amazing policies for wave energy. And when technologies actually came and tried to kind of take advantage of these policies, the government said, oh, but nobody applied when we set them. So we canceled the policies. Now we have nothing again. So please make them stable for enough time for us to actually kind of use these policies. This would be really helpful for us.
Over to you, Abigail, and I will challenge you to mention something that hasn't already been mentioned yet.
Okay. Well, I will do that because I'm going to think of it while I'm talking. But in the meantime, I would certainly echo, this certainty. We talked about this huge opportunity that we have, trillions of dollars of investment. To today's point, where's that investment going to come from? Well, it's going to come from many of the people in this room and their funds and their investments, and you need certainty. Before I did this, I was an attorney for private equity, and so I get it, right? You need certainty. That is the most important part. I think never underestimating the role that government can play in sending clear market signals, right? And so if it's a 0% carbon by a date certain, if it is, here are the rules of the marketplace, and we're going to reward or pay for capacity, right? Just the government says this is what we care about, and then the private industry can pivot and collaborate and compete and make it happen. I think the other piece of policy that I would say that hasn't been talked about really follows up on our workforce discussion. I started the conversation by talking about natural gas. We talked about the technology. We did not talk about all the people that work in natural gas, right? And as we think about this transition, it's certainly a transition of technology, but it's also a transition of people, right? People who may have formerly worked in fossil fuels who are faced with this perhaps opportunity or perhaps fear of working in a new industry. And so having the government spend some time and energy in reskilling some of those people, making sure that opportunity is available to them and training is available to them, so that there can be a transition that really builds up communities and doesn't feel like a threat to someone's way of life, would be a huge opportunity to have.
Awesome. And as somebody who's been in the oil and gas industry for a very long time, I'm actually very excited to be working on this transition with all of you today. And I'd love to be able to undergo that transition with everybody here today. So just as a recap, so for everybody listening in, the key elements that we talked about in terms of policy. So for all the policymakers and institutional bodies out there listening today, what the main things that the panelists talked about were really, I'd summarize it as certainty for reliability. Make the policy, then make the policy stable. Potential financial initiatives, so tax breaks of some kind, permitting, investments in transmission and distribution in order to build that out. Top-down direction, set the net zero targets, and most importantly, help to transition your workforce to make it all happen. Well, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for this panel discussion. Abigail, Danielle, Ina, Keith, Dr. Shaw, and Sujay, thank you so much. Have a lovely rest of the day. And to everybody listening, enjoy the rest of the forum. Thank you very much.